Hey everyone, welcome back. We're diving deep today into Mark chapters 6 through 8.
Yeah, these chapters are really fascinating.
They are. They're kind of like their own little mini-series, right?
Yeah,
Packed with drama,
yeah, a lot going on.
rejection and miracles and these big questions about who Jesus is and what it means to follow him.
Right, it's like watching the disciples wrestle with their faith in real time.
Yeah. Yeah, it makes you think about your own life. Like, have you ever felt like you were misunderstood because of your beliefs? Or maybe you doubted when things get tough?
Absolutely, and that's exactly where Mark takes us in these chapters. It starts with Jesus himself experiencing rejection in his hometown of Nazareth.
You'd think you'd get a hero's welcome, right?
You'd think so, but that's not what happens at all.
Instead, he gets shut out.
Yeah, it's pretty surprising. And instead of giving up or getting discouraged, you know what Jesus does?
What's he do? Sends out the disciples?
Exactly. He sends them out on their own mission.
Wow, talk about a tough lesson to learn early on. Like, keep going even when it hurts.
Right, and that's a challenge for all of us, isn't it?
Right.
Knowing when to persevere and when to maybe shift gears.
Definitely. But even more challenge maybe is what happens next with John the Baptist.
Yeah, John's story takes a dark turn in these chapters.
Imprisonment and execution by Herod. It's brutal.
It is, and it raises some tough questions about the cost of discipleship.
Like, is standing up for truth always worth it? Even if it means losing your life.
Right, and John's faith never wavered even in the face of death.
It's inspiring, but also kind of makes you wonder, is that kind of unwavering conviction something you're born with, or is it something you develop over time?
That's a good question, and I think it's probably a bit of both. But then Mark shifts gears again and takes us from this tragedy to a scene of abundance.
You talking about the feeding of the 5,000?
That's the one. 5 loaves and 2 fish.
Hardly enough for a snack, let alone thousands of people.
Right. But Jesus takes what little they have and multiplies it.
It's amazing, and it makes you think about those loaves and fishes and if they represent something more.
Oh, absolutely. Bread is often associated with spiritual nourishment. So maybe this miracle is pointing to Jesus as the source of that deeper kind of sustenance.
Meeting our spiritual hunger.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And that raises another question for us. Where do we see spiritual hunger in our own lives? And how are we trying to satisfy it?
That's a powerful connection. And then just when you think things can't get any more dramatic, Mark throws in another showstopper, Jesus walking on water.
Imagine being in that boat with the disciples in the middle of a storm, terrified, and then seeing Jesus walking towards you on the water.
I probably think I was hallucinating.
Right. It's more than just a cool miracle. It's a powerful image of Jesus' authority over nature.
And his presence with us even in our darkest moments.
Exactly. Like he's saying, I'm here with you in the storm.
But the disciples, they freak out. They think he's a ghost. It makes you wonder, are we sometimes so blinded by fear that we fail to recognize the very presence we're longing for?
That's a good point. Fear can definitely cloud our judgment and make us doubt even what's right in front of us.
We need to learn to see through the fear and recognize the divine in those unexpected places.
Absolutely. Now, in chapter 7, we see a different side of Jesus as he challenges traditions, specifically the rituals of the Pharisees.
Ah, yes. The Pharisees always so focused on the letter of the law.
Right? And Jesus calls them out. He says true defilement comes from within, not from what we eat or how we wash our hands.
Isn't it ironic how sometimes the things we do to appear righteous can actually be a mask for inner turmoil?
It's a powerful critique of hypocrisy. And it forces us to ask, are we more concerned with outward appearances than the state of our hearts?
Are we just checking boxes, or are we cultivating genuine faith?
And within this same chapter, we encounter this Syrophoenician woman pleading for her daughter's healing.
She's an amazing example of persistent faith.
She really is. Even when Jesus seems to rebuff her at first, she doesn't give up.
It's interesting, though, that Jesus eventually changes his mind. Why do you think that is? Is it about testing her faith? Or is he showing that even he can be moved by compassion?
It's a great question, and I think it speaks to the dynamic nature of faith. It's not always a straight line.
There are detours and challenges along the way.
Exactly. But the key is to keep seeking, to keep knocking on the door. The Syrophoenician woman teaches us that relentless faith can move mountains.
And sometimes even change hearts.
And right on the heels of that encounter, we get the story of the deaf and mute man. Jesus heals him using the Aramaic word aphatha, meaning be opened.
What strikes me about that story is the personal touch. It's not a mass healing, it's an intimate encounter.
It is. It's a beautiful picture of Jesus meeting individual needs in very personal ways.
It suggests that he sees us not just as a crowd, but as individuals with unique needs and desires.
Absolutely.
So we've got rejection miracles, challenges to tradition, and these deeply personal moments of healing. Where does Mark take us from here?
Well, buckle up because it's about to get even more intense. Well, Mark kicks off chapter 8 with another feeding miracle.
Another one. Wait a minute. Didn't we just cover that?
Yeah, but this time it's 4,000 people.
So are we seeing double here? Is this like a replay? Or is there a reason for this repetition?
It might seem like a repeat, but it actually emphasizes a key point.
Yeah.
It highlights Jesus's limitless compassion and ability to provide.
Okay, so it's not just about the miracle itself. It's about the message behind it.
Exactly. It's like he keeps saying, trust me, I've got this, even when we forget.
He's not a one-hit wonder. He's the ultimate provider.
That's a great way to put it. But what's really interesting is how the disciples react. Even after witnessing 2 feeding miracles, they're still confused.
Immediately, what do they say?
They're like, where could we possibly get enough bread in this remote place to feed all these people?
You'd think they'd have learned by now. But I guess it just shows even when we experience God's power firsthand, we can still struggle to grasp it.
We see that in our own lives, don't we? We pray for a breakthrough, and then when it arrives, we doubt if it's real or if it will last.
Makes you wonder if these repetitions are there to build our faith, remind us that God's provision is constant.
And then Mark shifts gears again, and we come to this pivotal moment where Jesus asks the disciples, who do you say I am?
That's a big question. It's like he's cutting through all the noise and getting to the heart of the matter.
It's the ultimate question, isn't it? Who is Jesus to each of us?
And it's Peter who steps up with the answer, you are the Messiah.
It's huge. You'd think that would be the happy ending, but it's not.
What happens?
Right after Peter's confession, Jesus starts talking about his suffering, his death, and his resurrection.
Whoa, talk about a mood swing. I can't imagine what the disciples must have been thinking.
It's like they finally reached the mountaintop, and then he tells them they have to go back down into the valley.
It's heavy stuff. And it makes you think about what it really means to be the Messiah.
We often focus on the triumphant, victorious aspects, but forget that true leadership often involves suffering and sacrifice.
So how do we reconcile those two ideas? The triumphant Messiah and the suffering servant.
That's a question that's been debated for centuries.
Can we hold both images in our minds at the same time?
I think we have to. It's the tension at the heart of the Christian faith.
It's not easy, though, is it?
No, it's not. And Jesus doesn't shy away from it. In fact, he makes it clear that suffering is part of following him. He calls his disciples to take up their cross and follow him.
That's a powerful image, but it's also a little unsettling.
Yeah. What does that look like in the 21st century? Are we all supposed to become martyrs?
I'm not sure I signed up for that.
I don't think it's necessarily about literal martyrdom. It's more about a willingness to let go of our own desires, our own comfort, and embrace a life of sacrifice and service.
So less about dramatic acts of self-sacrifice and more about the daily choices we make to put others first, to live out Jesus's values.
Exactly. It's about dying to ourselves so that we can truly live in him.
And that death to self can take many forms, right? Letting go of a grudge, giving our time to someone in need, speaking up for what's right.
Exactly. It's not about a single event. It's about a way of life.
A constant surrender to God's will.
Beautifully said. It's about saying yes to God, even when it's hard, even when it doesn't make sense, trusting that he will lead us through those valleys and onto the mountaintops.
It's not about seeking out suffering, but knowing that following Jesus will lead us through tough times.
Right. And it's in those times when we choose to surrender to God's will that we discover what discipleship really means.
Yeah, it's about aligning our desires with God's, recognizing that true fulfillment comes from living out his purpose for our lives. But how do we know what that purpose is?
I don't think there's one right answer.
Yeah.
For some, it might be a sudden revelation.
Yeah, like a bolt out of the blue.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But for others, it's more gradual.
A series of choices and experiences that lead them to their calling.
Right. But I think the key is to stay connected to God.
To listen for his voice and be open to how he might be leading us.
Yeah. It's not a one-time discovery. It's an ongoing conversation.
We're always learning and growing.
As we journey through these chapters in Mark, we see the disciples doing that.
They're trying to understand who Jesus is, what his mission is, and how they fit into it all.
And it's messy and confusing at times.
They make a lot of mistakes along the way.
They do. But each experience, each encounter shapes their faith and brings them closer to understanding Jesus.
It's actually kind of reassuring, Even the people closest to Jesus didn't always have it figured out.
Exactly. But they kept learning and growing.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into these chapters, what's the one key takeaway you hope listeners will carry with them?
I think it's the invitation to embrace the tension.
The tension.
Yeah, the tension between our human limitations and God's divine power, between our desire for comfort and the call to sacrifice, between the messiness of our lives and the beauty of God's grace.
It's in that tension that our faith is tested and refined.
Right. It's where we discover who Jesus really is and who we are called to be in him.
And it all comes down to trust.
Trusting Jesus even when we don't understand.
Even when it hurts.
Even when it feels like we're walking on water in the middle of a storm.
So to our listeners, as you go about your week, I hope you'll remember these stories we've explored, the challenges the disciples faced, and the unwavering love of Jesus that carries us through it all.
And ask yourself, where is Jesus calling you to trust him more deeply today? What does it mean for you to take up your cross and follow in the 21st century?
Let those questions guide your steps, and remember, the journey is just beginning. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into Mark chapters 6 through 8. We'll see you